This is Sultan Khatoon from Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Before we start, I hope that you had a good and relaxing Eid break and that you're back to work fresh, especially as we're now experiencing an increase in the rate of employees getting back to work. We at the Chamber, for instance, have increased the capacity for the last couple of weeks from 30% to 70%. And this week, we are back with 100% capacity with full responsibility and proper guidance and support from all relevant departments. So this is our first webinar at the new timing. We've decided to shuffle from a morning session at 11:30 based on various requests from people finding difficulty to attend during busy working hours. So we hope the new timing suits you well. As usual, some general housekeeping stuff before we kick off the discussion. For those of you who wish to attend this session in Arabic, please visit the link that will be shared by our team in the chat box. Please also do engage with us by submitting your questions in the Q&A box at the right bottom of your screen. And finally, a note for you that this session and all of Chamber Talks previous webinars are recorded and can be viewed on the Chamber's YouTube channel. Today, we're hosting Piers Quinn and Massimiliano Savarez from EY on a very interesting and broad topic, which we've covered some aspects of it from different angles on prior sessions of Chamber Talk. Personally, I'm very glad to reconnect with old colleagues in a special way. Actually, I had the pleasure to work with Piers on some interesting projects while working for EY. I didn't get the chance to work with Massimiliano or Max, but here we are on different type of collaboration, I would say. Piers and Max have a lot to say, so I'm gonna keep it short and simple by providing a high-level overview of the session before I properly introduce the gents and pass it to them to take the lead. So our topic for the day answers a key pressing question among all decision makers: how we ensure resilience as we plan for the future. The panel will cover this from two major aspects, and that's workforce planning and fund optimization. Max will kick off by talking about the recent emerging trends in the supply of talent and HR capability transformation, along with types, approaches, and optimization of workforce planning to meet business requirements. Then Piers will walk you through different practical approaches to developing financial forecasts and scenario planning while covering major components of a financial model, its inputs, outputs, and best practices. And he will then end by a very important section on understanding funding requirements and optimizing funding and the importance of having a funding strategy. So without any further delay, I'll introduce to you our expert speakers. Piers is an associate partner in turnaround and restructuring practice at EY Dubai. He has been in the MENA region since 2008, during which time he has worked with clients, supporting them across multiple complex engagements, covering turnaround and restructuring, debt advisory, due diligence, and corporate finance. Our second speaker for the day, Massimiliano, is an associate partner in people advisory services practice at EY Dubai as well. Max comes with more than 25 years of multi-industry experience. He partners with senior leaders on strategic, operational, and human capital issues to drive corporate strategy and transformational interventions. So the floor is yours. I'll pass it to Piers to have a quick intro about himself, and then he'll pass to Max.
Thank you very much, Sultan. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about business planning and funding to the Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce audience. And thank you very much for your introduction. You really covered what I've done very well. I've been in the region since 2008, been based between Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Probably over half of my time has been spent working with Abu Dhabi clients, from government entities all the way down to kind of small and medium enterprises. I help businesses across the range, from those that are having some level of distress, that need support in talking to banks and getting out of the situation they're in, two companies that are doing very well and just need to either optimize their liquidity or optimize their debt position. I'll hand it over to Max to go forward next.
Piers, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sultan, for the very kind words and for the invitation and giving us the opportunity to illustrate some relevant topics which these days are even more relevant because of the recent events in the world where we live in. Unlike my colleague Piers and Sultan, I joined EY very recently. It's been probably shy of half a year. As Sultan has indicated, I spent the majority, if not all, of my professional life in the industry, or I should say different number of industries, different geographies. Originally from Italy, but I've done very little work in my own country. I've been working across Europe, mostly Switzerland, United States, back to Switzerland, and since about 5 years I'm in the region, in Dubai, where I spent probably half of that time with a retail conglomerate here in Dubai, and the remaining time with an oil and gas company in Abu Dhabi. Very recently just came back to Dubai and initiated this new journey within EY as an associate partner in the people advisory. So I'm hoping to leverage the experience that I've accumulated over the years and put it to service to all our clients in the region and beyond. So given the flow of the topic, I thought I would start by covering the topic of workforce planning and optimization. I would love to give at first an overview of what you might agree are some of the current trends that definitely mark the territory in which organizations, small, medium, large, need to operate. You know, we know that over the coming decade, many jobs will be affected. On the slide, you read the word displaced. In reality, that word has a wider meaning. Some of these jobs will disappear. Some of these jobs will have to reconfigure. Some of the jobs will see and live a very, very big impact. You know, very often we come from generations, at least I do, where, you know, when you would decide what to study, you knew that that was going to impact the rest of your life. In reality, today, skills are going to become somewhat obsolete or in the need of being revisited on average every 5 years. Back in the days when I was probably my teen years, again, you would think that these skills would last for your professional life, 30, 35, 40 years. Now, there is an additional insight on this page which speaks of the importance of people-related analytics. Analytics, number, data, typically over the years has never been something very specific or connected to people agendas and to workforce. But in reality, there are a set of evidences that illustrate that when you do have analytics, and these analytics are well gathered and are scientifically gathered within the organization through multiple, you know, set of tools, but start obviously with a very strong ERP that supports an HR information system, it leads the organization to be able to take important information and to inform decisions and strategy in a more precise fashion. If we shift to actually look at what are the trends in the market, you see them listed here, but clearly there is a new digital or at times customer strategy, cost transformation type of trend. Operating models are very much changing. Even if I think of consulting firms that are dictated by COVID-19, the operating models and the way we deploy value to our clients has changed overnight. And there has to be an adaptation both from our point of view as a consultant workforce and the receiving end and the value that clients pay for. Cost reduction has always been I wouldn't call this a market trend, but always a definite must-have when in need. Introduction of robotics, artificial intelligence, outsourcing where not core to the value of an organization. Margins are shrinking, dictated by additional cost pressures that are coming from, 360 degrees. And then there are expectations, employee value propositions in the talent space that impact heavily the demand and supply of talent. In addition, for those of you in the audience who work in the HR capacity and profession, you will have noticed in the very last few years, there's a huge impact on our function. Our function is undergoing a massive transformation. One of them is the introduction as a massive strategic lever of workforce planning. And then business environment, but I would say not just business environment, the entire context can be very volatile. You can really bring to the equation things that were unknown until yesterday. So, I don't say this to kind of kill the concept of workforce planning, but there is only a certain amount of planning that can be done. Personally, I find that the word to be used on top of workforce planning is flexible workforce planning, which I know sounds almost as if we are defeating the purpose, but the environment and the business in which we operate will always have to be considered somewhat volatile and hence requiring an adaptation even of those plans. Moving forward onto the next slide, we will look at how can we actually prepare for the future. So if these are the trends, how can I look at my workforce within my organization and what are the aspects that I need to look at? And here you see the 4 C's, quite straightforward. You need to look at, do I have the right capability within my organization? What are these capabilities and do I have them at the right level? How much do they cost me? Is there a optimal cost benefit that I can strive to achieve? The capacity, do I have enough of this talent and are they distributed geographically and functionally in the right places, or do I need to displace them and convert them to different skill sets? And then the composition. You look at the right blend of the total FTE headcount that you have on your payroll. You look at those who come from the outside, offering the organization some level of flexibility with the contingent and gig workforce. You have shared services, you have automation. So the blend of all these 4 really should bring us to be able to take decisions in terms of understanding the future skills, staying competitive from a cost point of view, trying to not only say, I am good from a capacity point of view, but I want to look forward and try to anticipate what sizes do I need given the trends that I am observing in the market. And last, how do I critically source the skill set that I need and how do I adjust rapidly? Because let's not forget, I was trying to make a point before, but I realized I didn't use the right word. Workforce planning requires an agile type of planning. So the ability of the organization to make those tweaks, sometimes more substantial than others, so that the cost base, the capacity, the composition can be adjusted rapidly. The more flexible you keep your workforce, it goes without saying, the more rapidly you can adapt to the fluctuation. Moving forward, we can see that there are very different levels of maturity. If we move on to the next slide, please. And the one prior to this, the workforce planning. Very good, thank you so much. So we cannot make a statement that today everyone is in the most advanced level of workforce planning, which you would find on the top of this half pyramid with the integrated business planning. And we also want to say that probably many organizations have moved beyond the very basic level 1 budget-driven finance, blowing on the neck of HR people, trying to, in the last quarter of the year, plan a headcount for next year. First of all, if we really want to look into workforce planning and we want to call it strategic workforce planning, we should definitely be looking at something that goes beyond the 12 months. We should look at something that goes anywhere between the 3 to 5 years. But then you have those that come from the school of thought that 3 to 5 years is way too far, and the level of volatility that some industries experience make this process really not something that you can put as set in stone. So you look at the 3 to 5 year horizon, but you need to be ready to revisit those forecasts and those observations on a regular basis. It's a bit of a catch-22, because every time you plan, you get used to something, and we are all human, even within the remit of our profession. The moment we make ourselves used to a number, whether it's finance related or whether it's headcount related, we get used to it. And so any modification finds some level of resistance within the organization, some level of friction. So in here on this slide, you can see the various level of maturity, from, again, the very basic to the evolution of having some level of dashboards and standardized processes across the organization, across the group, if we're talking about large organization. Then you start looking at, okay, how can I use the numbers that I have available to predict what's coming around the corner? How can I use the numbers to inform my talent acquisition strategy? How can I use those numbers, for example, coming from performance management, to inform my development plan? And last but not least, how do I inform my succession plan? And by the way, succession plans can be done at very different levels. When it's done to large numbers, we talk about workforce planning. When it's done at talent management, top of the house, we're probably talking about key positions in the organization. Moving forward to the very next slide, there are a number of different things that we can do to bring forward workforce planning. The very first one is rather straightforward. Let's look ahead and let's look at what the requirements are. What are the business capabilities that I will need tomorrow, midterm, and long term? This obviously requires different parts of the organization, starting from the business, deciding what is the space where we will be playing in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and how does that translate in terms of workforce requirements. The very next thing you do is, okay, if that's the requirement, what do I have in the house? And if what I have in the house is not sufficient, and it might be not sufficient from a number point of view, it might not be sufficient from a capability point of view, you know, the resulting bit is let me dig, let me further understand what the demand is and where I'm going to get it. Do I need to go externally in the market? Do I need to further develop internally? Do I need to reconfigure? Do I need a cultural intervention? Because again, we might be dealing with nowadays a multi-generational workforce, which require a different approach when the organization has to put in place different strategies. So if tomorrow the organization starts implementing on a regular basis remote work, you might have some individuals who welcome this and will not accept to go back to the office for more than 2 days a week. You will have a workforce that comes from a very different background, different generation, and will absolutely want to go back to the office. So the company, the HR strategy, needs to really consider also the multi-generational coexisting within every organization. This gives you lead into the vertical number 4. How do I model and how do I deal with my gap? As an HR professional, I will not shy away after many years. I enjoy working on the gap because it gives me as an HR professional the opportunity to hire people, give people a job, or develop people that are internally already present with the organization. When you have the second part of the equation, the scenario of a surplus, clearly that's more of a challenging, not always amusing activity to bring forward, because it introduces the word of cost cutting, which we have elegantly labeled as optimization in most cases. But that's also a reality of life. So I have seen at times organizations that had to go down the harsh road of redeploying individuals outside, and these individuals having to take up additional challenges to find different roles in the world of work. And I've seen organizations where they've reinvented themselves. And so instead of letting go and laying off individuals, they were able to offer an alternative path, which is obviously what we would all aspire. Last but not least, you move to a design and a set of talent intervention. As I mentioned, whether it's learning and development intervention, whether it's to go out there and equip the organization with contingency workforce, whether it's putting in place a talent strategy when it comes to the acquisition phase, and then try to understand, how do I secure that my individuals, whether they stay in the organization or whether they go outside, they are employable. Ethically, I've also seen organizations where they say we have to make the hard call to let you go, but before letting you go, we want to make an investment in helping you reconfiguring your skill set, or at least start going in that direction, which I find to be an unbelievable, socially responsible action that organizations do choose to take towards employees who have dedicated, 1, 2, or multiple years of their professional life to their organization. Moving forward onto the next slides, very, very quickly, just because I thought it would be a mention that I make. Yes, we are from EY, but out there are a number of other professional firms. Each of us as players in the market have a number of tools. I thought I would just mention that these kind of tools do exist. Up to you to do your own homework and see what's available in the market. But there are tools. The point I want to make with this slide is not to, list what we have in EY, but rather there are tools that can make your life easier. There are tools that if you come in with 4, 5, 6, 7 input, there are platforms that can actually integrate all this input and create an output in terms of strategic workforce planning, design solutions, and in a way guide the organization in what should be the directional plan to satisfy those future needs that have been identified. Next slide, if you don't mind. We move into, again, the bit of workforce optimization. We can interpret this word in a very, wider manner. But at the end of the day, it's about looking of understanding what are the costs of my workforce components, whether that cost is deemed as being efficient from an organizational design point of view, or do I need to come in and try to identify if, I mentioned one, span of control is an area where we can intervene and reduce layers of the organization. For example, there are plenty of angles through which we can come in and look at cost efficiencies, not just numerosity of headcount as such, but literally how do we organize our functions in our organization. We look at workforce capacity requirements. Again, this slide in a way replicates what's been covered until now, but with an additional, accent on reducing the cost associated to the workforce. And so you need to create two things. One, the actual reduction of the absolute number, and two, equip the organization with flexibility. I find the second strategy, the one of equipping the organization with a flexible contingent workforce, typically more sustainable over time, because it really allows you to move up and down without massive additional cost. When you reduce your organization, but you stay on the level of salaried employees, fixed costs that have an attached cost to interrupt employment, and you still bring additional cost in the organization. So luckily, the world of work is also moving into a much higher appreciation of this gig economy. So individuals who choose for a living to put themselves into the market of working flexibly, working on assignments, geographically mobile. And this actually is an amazing weapon, for lack of a better word, for many organizations. Not every job, not every position can be given to a flexible worker, flexible solution, but there are plenty of jobs that can help the organization to keep that portion, whether it's substantial or minimal, but a certain portion of workforce somewhat flexible. I also want to be cognizant of time, and it's already 26 past 5. So I think without going into more details, I would want to pass it on to my colleague Piers, and then maybe we can come back to the topic of Q&A. Likewise, for workforce optimization, there are a number of tools that can be leveraged and can help you, along with your finance colleagues, to look into how to reduce costs when it comes to workforce. Happy to take, I'm not sure what we've agreed, Sultan, whether we're going to take questions now or we're going to, on this section, or whether we're going to take them all at the end. It's fine by me. So why don't we just move on to Piers. Thank you, Piers.
Thank you, Max. I've got quite a few slides. So I'm going to run through these quite quickly. You can have a look at them in more detail later on. So very quickly, the importance of having a financial plan. Having a financial plan will allow you to understand what's going to happen in the future, understand your business better. Does this business make sense? Should I be in this business? Should I be changing? Should I be looking to pivot into a new area? It will also help you understand the funding requirements, which we'll again come on to later on. It will help you with your performance tracking. So again, whether it's compensation or whether it's another format that you want to actually look at, how am I performing? How do I track? What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? So having that is a key benefit of a business plan. And then it's also very important to have scenario testing, particularly in these days where we see the market changing quite rapidly. And we've actually spent a lot of time with clients helping them understand the impact of different oil prices, different levels of customer demand, different levels they have in terms of key cost inputs. So having a business plan will allow you to look at each of these elements, and it really becomes one of the driving elements of any business. There's generally two approaches to financial forecasting. There's the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. The top-down approach is where we really look at what's the macro environment, how big is this possible market for us. And then we'll come up from the bottom-up approach, which is really based on, what have we seen over the previous years? What is the company performing? We might see a 5% increase in sales. What are our contracts telling us over the next few years? In reality, most business plans will have a combination of bottom-up and top-down. An example would be of a construction company where they would have a lot of contracts in hand, and that might cover 80% of their next year revenue and 75% of the year after, and they'll have their pipeline, which will feed into the next couple of years. But once you get out to 4 or 5 years, you don't actually have any contracts in place. And you have to look at what's the market for my particular area in construction. And the way we look at that is we look at the total available market. So how big is this market for our products? And then what is the serviceable market? So construction in the region may be 100 billion, but because you're only in a certain area, maybe Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the area is 10 billion. And then you have to look at what is the obtainable market. So the market may be 10 billion, but there's a lot of competition in that market. And based on your size, based on your capabilities, your market is probably 100 million, 200 million, 300 million. So it really depends on looking at those 3 areas. And that kind of gets you where our kind of top-down size of the business should be. The other way to look at it is look at, from the very bottom, what are the products and services that you offer? And in many cases, you break them down on products by product type. We'll then look at how much do you think you can sell, and then how much will those services be sold, and then that will translate into your revenue. Bottom up is normally based on all the information you have. It should be more secure. It should be more reliable. Top down is blue sky. It's more ambition. It's higher level. Both have benefits and disadvantages. With top down, again, it's very good for companies, startup or companies that are going into new areas. We deal with a lot of businesses that come into the region, whether they are setting up hospitals or building materials businesses or services businesses. They really need to look at what the potential market is. Those businesses that are actually here, they'll generally take a bottom-up approach. The top-down approach is again not as reliable. The forecasts are kind of generally seen as being a bit random, not as easy to benefit on, and the result of that will come into our funding later on. We'll discuss how that works. When we build a financial model, the best way that we like to set it out is we'll put all of our assumptions together in one sheet. We'll list out everything, and that will go from revenue, cost of goods sold, OPEX, personnel costs, CAPEX, and so on. We'll then have a separate area where we actually make all of the calculations, and then we'll have our output sheets. That will have our P&L account, balance sheet, cash flow statement, and KPIs. Having a model in this format will allow you to have your sensitivities, to understand what happens if my volume goes up, what happens if my pricing goes down, what happens if my raw material prices go up. So companies that are really susceptible to raw material changes, companies in the oil and gas industry, companies in petrochemicals, companies that have FX changes, having scenario planning is vitally important because they really need to be very nimble and react to these changes. I'm going to very quickly go through the inputs. I mean, again, hopefully these will all be won't be anything new. But the best way for your revenues is to it'll be the thing that drives your business, and it really should be set out on as much detail as possible for your product or your unit sold. What's the pricing going to be? What's the volume going to be? What's going to drive that volume? Really need to understand that. This will help determine the pricing structure that you have. Again, have to understand how the price volume impacts the business and what's the optimal level. Again, that's a key thing you'll get from the business plan. Cost of goods sold. This was all the costs that you will need to sell your product. Whether it's raw materials, utilities, personnel costs, depreciation would go in here, but you will make that separately. Operating expenses. So what are the costs of actually being in business? Marketing, legal costs, payroll for those not part of cost of goods sold, rent, utilities for offices, all those kind of overhead costs. Really important to get those right. We often find a lot of businesses have their revenue and cost of goods sold pretty accurate, but they really don't control the OPEX. And having a very strong business plan will allow you to really focus on what your costs are. It's now very common to have zero-based budgets. Actually, companies will come along at the beginning, toward the beginning of each year, and look at what their costs are going to be on a zero basis and build them up, rather than just increase them by 5 or 10% every year. So the personnel costs should go into the cost of goods sold and the OPEX, but often we set them out separately just so that they're seen. Really have to understand, how many employees do you need, what level of salary will they get, what other costs that they will have, insurance, visas, applied. So all of those costs need to be calculated and set out correctly. Capital expenditure, again, very important element to have. We really depend on the type of business. If it's a very capex intensive business, it needs to be very well set out. If you're developing new plants or machinery or building a greenfield project, very important to make sure you have the accurate costs in. It's very common to see people decide to go into a greenfield area and have their costs increase 10, 20, 30%. So it's really important to make sure you have that flexibility in the model to understand what happens if my capex goes higher, and therefore you can have the scenario of how you plan and deal with that. Financing, very important. How are you going to finance the business? Equity, debt, what type of equity, what type of debt is important. Really important to understand the interest expense that you have to incur. Having a well set out business plan with the right assumptions, you will then understand what are the financing that you need for that. I'll have a little bit more detail on that later on. Very, very, very important to have working capital. We've seen a lot of businesses that have really understood the costs and the income side of the business, but didn't understand the working capital side, and actually then run out of funding. And so, I've seen a number of businesses where they set up these kind of state-of-the-art plants. There's a great market for them. They know how to manufacture the business, but because the working capital cycle wasn't calculated correctly, they actually run out of money and they can't afford finance to buy new products. And that's actually when I worked with a lot of businesses in the restructuring area. Depreciation, again, depreciation is how we look at the assets and how we divide the costs over the period. This is a non-cash expense, so it's very important that you have it in your P&L, but you have to adjust for it in your cash flow statement. Taxes, again, very important to understand what the taxes are and the timing of the tax payments. So again, VAT in the region, import duty would be very important to know. If you've got companies that have income tax at revenue outside of the region, again, very important to know that. And quite often in our financial models, we will see kind of some valuation metrics. So if you're looking to raise equity, part of the fundraising process, the investors will actually look at the financial model and we'll be able to show them returns. And quite often you have different scenarios. So based on scenario A, my return will be X. Based on scenario B, my return could be Y. Again, this should be very straightforward. The profit and loss account, balance sheet, and cash flow statement are the key areas that we'll have going outputs from the financial model. There really should be outputs. There shouldn't be any calculations we put into these sheets, but that will tell us what we want to see in the business. That will tell us, is the business going to be profitable? This will tell us what are the funding requirements. This will tell us what will be the assets and liabilities of the business going forward. It's also very important to have KPIs. Most of the best practice in developing financial models now will be where we would have a one sheet that really kind of covers all the key metrics of the business. That can be cash flow, it can be EBITDA, it can cover our margins, it can cover our working capital ratios, days sales outstanding, days inventory outstanding, and days purchases outstanding. We'll cover our leverage ratios, net debt to EBITDA, net debt to equity, debt service coverage ratio, interest coverage. So having all of the sheet together is very important, and really have one sheet that will really tell everyone what they need to know on the business. So there's some best practices when it comes to developing a financial model. As I said earlier, having separate inputs, calculations, and output sheets is key. Where you have each input and during the outputs, it's very important to identify the units of measurements. So again, have the currency consistent. of if it's going to be.
Pierce, sorry, the line is cutting a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Apologies, everyone. I'll try and talk louder. Avoid embedding hard-coded inputs into formulas. I'll show you an example of that later. Avoid cell references, where it just is referencing itself. Use consistent formats and formulas. Keep it simple. I spent, most of the last 12 years looking at financial models. The ones where people have issues with are where they kind of, try to be too clever, try to have too many formulas in one calculation. Really keep it simple, keep it logical, keep it laid out is the best. It's important to consider restricting the inputs where possible. And it's important, so again, by having the restricted inputs, really allows you to control what people are doing, and they won't go away and start putting in the wrong areas. It's very important to have checks in each section. So make sure the balance sheet balances, make sure that the cash in the cash flow statement reconciles with the cash in the balance sheet. Make sure the movement in equity matches the P&L for the year. And then it's very important to review and test the model. So when we start testing the model, we play around with the assumptions, we'll find out that things work, they don't work. So, and then have a very thorough review of it by a second party afterwards is also key. So the example of the hard-coded inputs in the formulas is here, where we see in the sales tax, they just added sales value by 12%. Now, if something changes, if I want to make an adjustment, I'm stuck. I can't have to go and change every single cell. But if I have it completely laid out, all I have to do is change one assumption and everything else will change. And VAT can change. We've seen it happen in Saudi. So every single input should be able to be set out. The other thing we see is where we have a circular reference where someone in the cell is referencing another cell. That will mean the model doesn't work, and that will mean we have issues. Thankfully, Excel will tell us about this, but we really have to be very careful when we're setting up our models. Some best practices. It's really important to make sure the financial plan is in line with your business plan. If I'm planning to expand to a new country, if I'm planning to build a new plant, if I'm planning to invest in IT, that all has to be in the financial plan. It's really important to make the assumptions and what's driving those assumptions very, very clear. So if I believe sales are going to increase by 5%, I need to be clear on that. So if I got a basis for my cost of goods sold, that needs to come true. So to have a very strong model, I need to have backup for every single key assumption that can be defended. Again, look at when it's appropriate to do the bottom-up forecasting, but also when it's appropriate to have the top-down forecasting. Again, very important to know your margins. It really is a key driver that we find a lot of people will, again, as kind of a top-down approach, will just apply a profit margin and instead of looking at each of the cost drivers. So you need to make sure that you have the right margins and understand how those margins will change going forward. It's also good to have ratios as a sanity check. So in a lot of models, we will look at the leverage, we'll look at the IRRs, we'll look at the margins, we'll look at the sales growth. Do these actually make sense? I've seen financial models that were put together by very, very competent people, but when you actually step back and look at it and say, well, for a business in this industry, those margins are too high. For a business in this industry, that leverage is too high. That revenue growths are too high. Again, create different scenarios. So again, we'll come on to this slightly later, but it's very important to have kind of different stress test scenarios. we'll quite often have a base case and then a low side case to understand what happens if we don't meet our assumptions. Quite often I see businesses that what we have are called the hockey stick, where they have these fantastic growth assumptions and very, very aggressive. And on paper, it looks great, but we really need to understand what happens if we don't, instead of having 100% utilization of the plant, we have 80% utilization. What happens if we don't win this contract? What happens if our margins aren't sustainable because there's new people coming into the market? So it's very important to have those scenarios and understand. And it's very important to leverage existing platforms for research. So particularly for the top-down assumptions, you really need to look at, where are we getting the information from the market? What are the sources we're going to use? So they need to be reliable sources. It can't be just something you find on the internet. It needs to be something that's strong and is something that is reliable. It's also important to make sure don't make your revenues either over optimistic or pessimistic. If they're pessimistic, then we might be not seizing the full opportunity. We not be taking on enough capex or enough employees to meet that. But if we're over optimistic, we'll end up taking on a lot of funding and not be able to meet it. Really need to explain what funding is needed. Again, we'll come into that in a little bit more detail. But there's no point in having a very strong business plan with a lot of great assumptions and we'll build new plans and expand into new countries without actually understanding where the funding is going to come from. Don't underestimate the required employee size. Again, as you get bigger, you'll find that you need more people just to manage people. We've seen that that's a huge issue when I've seen companies that have grown very quickly and then got into trouble because the resourcing wasn't quite right. And that's completely taken from what Max has given us earlier on. Again, important to ensure that the forecast revenues are in line with the market size. I've seen business plans where people are going to get 80% of the market within 5 years, which again, given it's a very competitive market, doesn't seem realistic. Again, I mentioned earlier on, it's important to have the right operational expenses in there. People can tend to forget about some of these expenses. And I said again, very important to remember the importance of working capital. I can't stress that enough. So we mentioned scenario planning. So once you have the financial model that's very well set out and you have all the key assumptions, in the scenario planning, we can play around with what happens. What happens if our sales volume goes down? How do we adjust our price? What happens if our cost of materials go up? Do we increase our price and then have our sales volume go down? What happens if our working capital structure, working capital cycle increases? So having all of these things that are flexible allows you to run these scenarios. And then looking at the different scenarios will allow you to plan for mitigation actions. And that's what's really important about scenario planning. So, in this current COVID-19 situation, we're working with lots of businesses to try and help them understand the impact on their business. So if they see volumes that are way down, they have to start looking at workforce optimization. They have to start looking at cutting other costs. They have to look at going to raise additional financing. They have to go to the banks and talk about getting payment holidays. So this is all that happens is allowing us to have the flexibility. We can undertake scenario planning and then undertake mitigation actions. So in terms of funding, having a strong, well laid out financial model will allow us to understand what are the funding requirements. Am I in a situation where I need to fund operations because they're not funding themselves at the moment? Maybe I'm in a wind up growth mode. Maybe I'm in a situation at the moment where because the market isn't there, I need to those funds for a period of time. Do I need to fund working capital? So working capital is a separate thing. I need that to fund my business. and I need to carve out that funding. Capital expenditure. Again, what am I getting the capital expenditure? I should, in my business plan, I should see capital expenditure going in as cost, but I should see a result of that coming out. So how do I fund capital expenditure? Again, do I go to banks? Do I ask them to fund that? Because there's an asset there, it's generally easier to get funded. Do I have to meet debt obligations? So I'll look at my business plan and see, I have a lot of debt obligations coming up over the next few years. Am I getting the funding for my operations to meet those? If not, I need to talk to the banks. I might have shareholder obligations. So certain shareholders might have borrowed to help set up the fund the company. They are expecting a certain level of dividends. So understanding each of those aspects, and that's operational, that's what we call investing, and that's what we call financial cash flows. We need to understand what each one of those is. And once we understand that, we'll help develop a financial strategy to meet those requirements. So it's very important to develop that strategy. It's important to look at the timing. It's important to ensure you take the right amount. You need to balance the risks between equity and debt. You also need to be very clear on what are the best sources. So you actually go after those sources. Small businesses shouldn't be issuing bonds or going for IPOs, but they have separate sources such as potentially peer-to-peer lending or venture capital funds or private equity funds. Very important to understand how much you need, understand what are you willing to give up. Are you willing to give up equity? Are you willing to give up what guarantees, either personal or corporate? If you're getting equity, what is that equity partner bringing? Do they bring technology? Do they bring in market? You need to understand when you can repay the funds based on your financial plan, and you need to understand when will the funds be required. And then for that, again, there's a cycle that you will need to go through. You can get out with advisors, you can get out by yourself, but it's really important to understand and go through that market in a systematic basis. Very quickly, there's different options for funds. It is possible to get government grants, particularly if you're a startup in the region. Debt, if you're a business that's established, or if you've got a level of assets, debt is easier to get. If you're a business that's not established and you're a startup, you're an SME, you're mainly going to be funded by equity. And then there's convertible debt, which is kind of less seen, but we just actually saw an example of Mubadala putting convertible debt into Arab tech. So having a look at all of the examples of what's coming out of our business plan, what funding do we need, what's our funding strategy, we have to look through what are our shareholder objectives, what's the market opportunity, what's the business focus, and going through all of that to understand what is the optimal level. Is it debt? Is it equity? Equity is more expensive than debt, but debt actually has a cash outflow that you need to meet. And if you don't meet it, you can lose control of the business to the banks. So that's the end of my presentation. We'll have a little bit of time for questions, which I'll let Sultan lead.
Yeah, thank you, Piers. Thank you, Max. Very interesting, very straightforward, I would say, highlighting very important aspects of developing a forecast model and considering all of the different things that need to be included. Same as well for Max from a HR or workforce perspective. So Piers, on that point which you've ended, so funding a business could be through debt or equity, as you mentioned. If it's debt, so bankers would be looking at specific aspects of your business. If it's equity, it would be investors who are doing so. So allow me, please, I'm going to have a question that would have two components. So what do bankers typically would want from a business before they provide financing? And for the equity investments, what do equity investors look for in a business when investing?
Sorry. In both aspects, they're going to look at the financial information of the business. They're going to look at the audited financials, and look at the management accounts, and they're going to put a lot of emphasis on the business plan. For a bank, they will want to be secure on the cash flows coming out of the business plan will be sufficient to meet the interest and principal payments. They'll also want to have security. So if for whatever reason the business plan cannot be met, what assets can they take as security? So they really want to have that security. So they like to invest in capital intensive businesses where they can, if it's a real estate, they can take that back and sell it. And they'll also want to have guarantees. So can they have a corporate guarantee of the parent, or can they have a personal guarantee of the investors? So they'll look to have those three areas. Investors, particularly on the smaller side, will really want to understand who they're actually investing with. Is that relationship strong? They're investing as much with the individual as much as anything else. So they really need to have a very strong focus that they can get on with the individual, that they see eye to eye. If I've seen a lot of businesses where there's a very good opportunity, but the investors were in alignment in terms of one wanted to grow the business very big, and the other person wanted to secure dividends to fund other aspects of their lives and their investments. So that's the key difference between the two businesses. Equity is generally like a marriage, where the banks are a bit more cutthroat, and they're kind of happy to be secure that they have the cash flows, they have the assets, and if required, they'll go after the guarantees.
Thank you, Piers. A question for Max on, so what are the typical pitfalls of the workforce planning process from your experience?
Thanks for the question, Sultan. Look, let me be very straightforward. Workforce planning is far from being a universally, proven science for all the ills that any organization needs to face in this volatile business. But because of that reason, the HR function really, who's looking at implementing a workforce planning solution, needs to be aware that there are some downside. And I think earlier in the presentation, I mentioned one, but there is another one. So the very first one is any plan can create inertia, right? A workforce plan is aiming at creating some level of strategic set of HR goals, which align with a wider set of corporate goals. However, there is always a risk that the time that is spent researching and analyzing how to implement never really makes it to see the light. I say this with a smile on my face, and please bear in mind I am from the HR function, but at times in HR we do end up falling in love with ourselves, right? With our processes, with our policies, and we lose sight of why we do some of these activities. So the invitation is to keep an eye on, yes, do what is required to do the planning, but don't lose sight of the fact that we're trying to accomplish at the end of the day a business goal, not an HR goal isolated. Second, planning can also limit our ability to stay flexible. As I mentioned, we're human, and once we set our eyes on something we want to achieve, we develop along the same line some level of resistance. Now, this resistance is not a good ingredient of keeping our plans flexible when they need to be. And eventually, the very last one is complacency. So we in HR, and forgive me if the audience is all from HR, I don't mean to be critical of the HR function, but having spent there a number of years, I tend to see more what HR can do better than the line, than the business. At the end of the day, we exist to support and drive the business towards business goals. But complacency HR at times needs to be aware that having a workforce plan may create assumptions that everything is in hand, and this creates the pitfall of losing sight that we need to actually run the implementation, detect changes before they actually happen, not when they happen. So keeping a proactive mindset and a strategic eye remains very, very important.
Thank you, Max. Actually, we're running out of time, but I'm going to have two last questions, one for Piers and one for Max. Piers, so if companies want to go in the process of raising debt, what can be done? What would be your advice for companies willing to raise?
Yeah, so I think it's really understand, have a very strong financial model to understand what they're going to do, what's that debt going to be used for, when will they be able to generate positive cash flows to repay the debt. So that's the first step. Second step is understand what security can they offer. So they'll need to have a strong package that can be offered, and if it's not a physical asset, then it's a guarantee. Or else, if that's not possible, we'll have to put mainly equity into this investment or into the business. Very important to articulate, what that, the story of the business plan and why it makes sense. And then it's important to, sound out the market. So have a discussion with different banks, understand what the banks need, understand what banks want to be in what area. Certain banks, for example, are very focused on certain areas. Some banks are more aggressive than others. So very important to understand the market. And it's not, again, depending on where the business is, it's not necessarily just bank funding. There is mezzanine funding is also available. It's a lot more expensive, but it's cheaper than equity. And they can actually help support the business grow. So they're more of an equity type partner than a funder.
Thanks, Piers. The last question for Max. And apologies if I couldn't pick all the questions from the audience. What kind of questions does HR need to ask during the workforce planning process, and what conversations to have with business leaders?
Thank you, Sultan. I think we would need a good additional hour to properly answer this question. The questions that HR can actually ask business leaders are many. And maybe rather than listing the questions, which, I can give you a couple. Right? How many people do you believe will be leaving your organization, both voluntarily and involuntarily, in your business unit or in your business or in a certain geography? As a business leader, I could ask you from an HR point of view, what kind of skill set those employees will need. And it's not that I'm intending to put these questions on the business leader as such, because probably the business leader is going to turn around and say, you in HR need to help me answer this question, and that's fine. What I'm trying to pass on here as a message is HR needs to ask the right questions to business leaders to create a sense of urgency around the importance of this planning. Business leaders are busy people. They run the company, and typically they are drawn into achieving goals for the fiscal year. And this can be an amazing focus, but it can also be distracting. So forgive me if I'm about to use this expression, but we almost need to create some level of fear into the business leaders to secure that they put the right emphasis in working together with us and achieve a solid, robust workforce planning. Happy to take on, and to provide additional questions if the colleagues on the call need them. And allow me to take this opportunity to, thank you for the opportunity and the audience, obviously.
Thank you, Max. Pierce, any last words before I close from my end as well?
No, I just want to thank everyone for their time on the webinar. My contact details will be on the deck. If anyone has any questions and they want to reach out to me, please feel free. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about business planning and fund optimization.
Thank you, James. It's really very, very interesting topic which you've covered today. I hope the audience would get all the insights provided by you on it. I want to thank you for your time and thank the audience as well for their time in attending this session. Please be tuned with us next week. We have on Sunday, on the 9th of August, PwC on transitioning to the new normal. And on Tuesday, we are going to be with KPMG on digitalization and investing in technology resilience post-COVID-19. Until then, stay safe and have a good day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.